Brought to you by Penguin.
The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot, read by Anne-Marie Duff.
Both for ease of listening and because it contains details of the plot, we've placed the introduction to this Penguin classic at the end of the audiobook.
Volume 1, Book First, Boy and Girl. Chapter 1. Outside Dorlcote Mill. A wide plain, where the broadening Floss hurries on between its green banks to the sea, and the loving tide, rushing to meet it, checks its passage with an impetuous embrace. On this mighty tide the black ships, laden with the fresh-scented fir planks, with rounded sacks of oil-bearing seed, or with the dark glitter of coal, are borne along to the town of St Ogg's, which shows its aged, fluted red roofs and the broad gables of its wharves between the low wooded hill and the river-bank, tinging the water with a soft purple hue under the transient gaze of this February sun. Far away on each hand stretched the rich pastures and the patches of dark earth, made ready for the seed of broad-leaved green crops, or touched already with the tint of the tender-bladed autumn-sown corn. There is a remnant still of the last year's golden clusters of beehive ricks rising at intervals beyond the hedgerows, and everywhere the hedgerows are studded with trees. The distant ships seem to be lifting their masts and stretching their red-brown sails close among the branches of the spreading ash. Just by the red-roofed town, the tributary Ripple flows with a lively current into the Floss. How lovely the little river is with its dark, changing wavelets. It seems to me like a living companion while I wander along the bank and listen to its low, placid voice, as to the voice of one who is deaf and loving. I remember those large, dipping willows. I remember the stone bridge. And this is Dorlcote Mill. I must stand a minute or two here on the bridge and look at it, though the clouds are threatening, and it is far on in the afternoon. Even in this leafless time of departing February, it is pleasant to look at. Perhaps the chill, damp season adds a charm to the trimly kept, comfortable dwelling-house, as old as the elms and chestnuts that shelter it from the northern blast. The stream is brim-full now, and lies high in this little withy plantation, and half drowns the grassy fringe of the croft in front of the house. As I look at the full stream, the vivid grass, the delicate bright green powder softening the outline of the great trunks and branches that gleam from under the bare purple boughs, I am in love with moistness, and envy the white ducks that are dipping their heads far into the water here among the withes, unmindful of the awkward appearance they make in the drier world above. The rush of the water and the booming of the mill bring a dreamy deafness which seems to heighten the peacefulness of the scene. They are like a great curtain of sound, shutting one out from the world beyond. And now there is the thunder of the huge covered wagon coming home with sacks of grain. That honest waggoner is thinking of his dinner, getting sadly dry in the oven at this late hour, but he will not touch it till he has fed his horses. The strong, submissive, meek-eyed beasts, who, I fancy, are looking mild reproach at him from between their blinkers, that he should crack his whip at them in that awful manner, as if they needed that hint. See how they stretch their shoulders up the slope towards the bridge, with all the more energy because they are so near home. Look at their grand shaggy feet that seem to grasp the firm earth, at the patient strength of their necks bowed under the heavy collar, at the mighty muscles of their struggling haunches. I should like well to hear them neigh over their hardly earned feed of corn, and see them, with their moist necks freed from the harness, dipping their eager nostrils into the muddy pond. Now they are on the bridge, and down they go again at a swifter pace, and the arch of the covered wagon disappears at the turning behind the trees. Now I can turn my eyes towards the mill again, and watch the unresting wheel sending out its diamond jets of water. That little girl is watching it too. She has been standing on just the same spot at the edge of the water ever since I paused on the bridge, and that queer white cur with the brown ear seems to be leaping and barking in ineffectual remonstrance with the wheel, Perhaps he is jealous because his playfellow in the beaver bonnet is so rapt in its movement. It is time the little playfellow went in, I think, and there is a very bright fire to tempt her. The red light shines out under the deepening grey of the sky. It is time, too, for me to leave off resting my arms on the cold stone of this bridge. Oh, my arms are really benumbed. I have been pressing my elbows on the arms of my chair and dreaming that I was standing on the bridge in front of Dorlcote Mill as it looked one February afternoon many years ago. Before I dozed off, I was going to tell you what Mr and Mrs Tulliver were talking about as they sat by the bright fire in the left-hand parlour on that very afternoon I have been dreaming of. Chapter 2. Mr Tulliver of Dorlcote Mill declares his resolution about Tom. "What I want, you know," said Mr Tulliver, "what I want is to give Tom a good education. An education as'll be a bread to him. That's what I was thinking on when I gave notice for him to leave the academy at Lady Day. I mean to put him to a downright good school at Midsummer. The 2 years at the academy had I done well enough if I'd meant to make a miller and farmer of him, for he's had a fine sight more schooling nor I ever got. All the learning my father ever paid for was a bit of birch at one end and the alphabet at t'other. But I should like Tom to be a bit of a scholard, so as he might be up to the tricks of those fellows as talk fine and right with a flourish. It'd be a help to me with these lawsuits and arbitrations and things. I wouldn't make a downright lawyer of the lad, I should be sorry for him to be a rascal, but a sort of engineer or a surveyor or an auctioneer and valuer, like Riley, or one of them smartish businesses as are all profits and no outlay, only for a big watch chain and a high stool. They're pretty nigh all one, and they're not far off being even with the law, I believe. For Riley looks Lawyer Wakeham in the face as hard as one cat looks another. He's none frightened at him." Mr Tulliver was speaking to his wife, a blonde, comely woman in a fan-shaped cap. I'm afraid to think how long it is since fan-shaped caps were worn. They must be so near coming in again. At that time, when Mrs Tulliver was nearly 40, they were new at St Ogg's and considered sweet things. "Well, Mr Tulliver, you know best. I've no objections, but hadn't I better kill a couple of fowl and have the aunts and uncles to dinner next week, so as you may hear what Sister Glegg and Sister Pullet have got to say about it? There's a couple of fowl wants killing." "You may kill every fowl in the yard if you like, Bessie, but I shall ask neither aunt nor uncle what I'm to do with me own lad," said Mr Tulliver defiantly. "Dear heart," said Mrs Tulliver, shocked at this sanguinary rhetoric. "How can you talk so, Mr Tulliver? But it's your way to speak disrespectful of my family, and Sister Glegg throws all the blame upon me, though I'm sure I'm as innocent as the babe unborn, for nobody ever heard me say as it wasn't lucky for my children to have aunts and uncles as can live independent. However, if Tom's to go to a new school, I should like him to go where I can wash him and mend him, else he might as well have calico as linen, for there'd be one as yallow as the other before they'd been washed half a dozen times. And then, when the box is going backwards and forwards, I could send the lad a cake or a pork pie or an apple, for he can do with an extra bit, bless him, whether they stint him at the meals or no. My children can eat as much victuals as most, thank God." Well, we won't send him out of reach of the carrier's cart if other things fit in," said Mr Tulliver. "But you mustn't put a spoke in the wheel about the washing if we can't get to school near enough. That's the fault I have to find with you, Bessie. If you see a stick in the road, you're allus thinking you can't step over it. You'd want me not to hire a good waggoner, 'cause he'd got a mole on his face." "Dear heart," said Mrs Tulliver in mild surprise. "When did I ever make objections to a man because he'd got a mole on his face? I'm sure I'm rather fond of the moles, for my brother, as is dead and gone, had a mole on his brow. But I can't remember your ever offering to hire a waggoner with a mole, Mr Tulliver. There was John Gibbs hadn't a mole on his face, no more than you have, and I was all for having you hire him. And so you did hire him, and if he hadn't died of the inflammation, as we paid Dr Turnbull for attending him, he'd very likely have been driving the waggon now. He might have a mole somewhere out of sight, but how was I to know that, Mr Tulliver?" No, Bessie, I didn't mean justly the mole.
I meant it to stand for summat else, but never mind. It's puzzling work, talking is. What I'm thinking on is how to find the right sort of school to send Tom to, for I might be ta'en in again, as I've been with Academy. I'll have nothing to do with Academy again. Whatever school I send Tom to, it shan't be Academy. It shall be a place where the lads spend their time is summat else besides blacking the family shoes and getting up the potatoes. It's an uncommon puzzling thing to know what school to pick.
Mr Tulliver paused a minute or two and dived with both hands into his breeches pockets as if he hoped to find some suggestion there. Apparently he was not disappointed, for he presently said,
I know what I'll do. I'll talk it over with Riley. He's coming tomorrow to arbitrate about the dam.
Well, Mr Tulliver, I've put the sheets out for the best bed, and Kezzy has got 'em hanging at the fire. They aren't the best sheets, but they're good enough for anybody to sleep in, be he who he will.
For as for them best Holland sheets, I should repent buying 'em, only they'll do to lay us out in. And if you was to die tomorrow, Mr Tulliver, they're mangled beautiful, and all ready, and smell of lavender as it'd be a pleasure to lay 'em out, and they lie at the left-hand corner of the big oak linen chest at the back, not as I should trust anybody to look 'em out but myself.
As Mrs Tulliver uttered the last sentence, she drew a bright bunch of keys from her pocket and singled out one, rubbing her thumb and finger up and down it with a placid smile, while she looked at the clear fire. If Mr Tulliver had been a susceptible man in his conjugal relations, he might have supposed that she drew out the key to aid her imagination in anticipating the moment when he would be in a state to justify the production of the best Holland sheets. Happily, he was not so. He was only susceptible in respect of his right to water power. Moreover, he had the marital habit of not listening very closely, and, since his mention of Mr Riley, had been apparently occupied in a tactile examination of his woollen stockings.
I think I've hit it, Bessie, was his first remark, after a short silence. Riley's as likely a man as any to know a summer school. He's had a schooling himself, and goes about to all sorts of places, arbitrating and valuing and that. And we shall have time to talk it over tomorrow night when the business is done. I want Tom to be such a sort of man as Riley, you know, as can talk pretty nigh as well as if it was all wrote out for him, and knows a good lot of words as don't mean much, so as you can't lay hold of 'em in law, and a good solid knowledge of business too.
Well, said Mrs Tulliver, so far as talking proper and knowing everything, and walking with a bend in his back and setting his hair up, I shouldn't mind the lad being brought up to that. But them fine talking men from the big towns mostly wear the false shirt fronts. They wear a frill till it's all a mess and then hide it with a bib. I know Riley does. And then, if Tom's to go and live at Mudport, like Riley, he'll have a house with a kitchen hardly big enough to turn in, and never get a fresh egg for his breakfast, and sleep up 3 pair of stairs, or 4 for what I know, and be burnt to death before he gets down.
No, no, said Mr Tulliver. I've no thoughts of his going to Mudport. I mean to set up his office at St Ogg's, close by us, and live at home. But, continued Mr Tulliver after a pause, what I'm a bit afraid on is, as Tom hasn't got the right sort of brains for a smart fella. I doubt he's a bit slowish. He takes after your family, Bessie.
Yes, that he does,
said Mrs Tulliver, accepting the last proposition entirely on its own merits.
He's wonderful for liking a deal of salt in his broth. That was my brother's way, and my father's before him.
It seems a bit of a pity, though, said Mr Tulliver, as the lad should take after the mother's side, instead of the little wench. That's the worst on't, with the crossing of breeds. You can never justly calculate what'll come on't. The little un takes after my side now. She's twice as cute as Tom. Too cute for a woman, I'm afraid, continued Mr Tulliver, turning his head dubiously first on one side and then on the other. It's no mischief much while she's a little un, but an over-cute woman's no better nor a long-tailed sheep. She'll fetch none the bigger price for that.
Yes, it is a mischief while she's a little un, Mr Tulliver, for it all runs to naughtiness. How to keep her in a clean pinafore 2 hours together passes my cunning. And now you put me in mind, continued Mrs Tulliver, rising and going to the window, I don't know where she is now, and it's pretty nigh tea time. Ugh, I thought so. Wandering up and down by the water like a wild thing. She'll tumble in some day.
Mrs Tulliver rapped the window sharply, beckoned and shook her head, a process which she repeated more than once before she returned to her chair.
You talk of cuteness, Mr Tulliver, she observed as she sat down, but I'm sure the child's half an idiot in some things, for if I send her upstairs to fetch anything, she forgets what she's gone for, and perhaps will sit down on the floor in the sunshine and plait her hair and sing to herself like a bedlam creature, all the while I'm waiting for her downstairs. That never run in my family, thank God, no more nor a brown skin as makes her look like a mulleter. I don't like to fly in the face of Providence, but it seems hard as I should have but one girl, and her so comical.
Pooh! Nonsense, said Mr Tulliver.
She's a straight, black-eyed wench as anybody need wish to see.
I don't know in what she's behind other folks' children. And she can read almost as well as the parson.
But her hair won't curl all I can do with it, and she's so franzy about having it put in paper, and I've such work as never was to make her stand and have it pinched with the irons.
Cut it off short, said the father rashly.
How can you talk so, Mr Tulliver? She's too big a girl, gone 9, and tall of her age, to have her hair cut short. And there's her cousin Lucy got a row of curls round her head, and not a hair out of place. It seems hard as my sister Dean should have that pretty child. I'm sure Lucy takes more after me nor my own child does.
Maggie, continued the mother, in a tone of half-coaxing fretfulness, as this small mistake of nature entered the room.
Where's the use of my telling you to keep away from the water? You'll tumble in and be drowned some day, and then you'll be sorry you didn't do as mother told you.
Maggie's hair, as she threw off her bonnet, painfully confirmed her mother's accusation. Mrs Tulliver, desiring her daughter to have a curled crop,
like other folks' children,
had had it cut too short in front to be pushed behind the ears, and as it was usually straight an hour after it had been taken out of paper, Maggie was incessantly tossing her head to keep the dark, heavy locks out of her gleaming black eyes, an action which gave her very much the air of a small Shetland pony.
Oh dear, Maggie. What are you thinking of? To throw your bonnet down there? Take it upstairs, there's a good girl, and let your hair be brushed, and put your other pinafore on, and change your shoes. Do, for shame. And come and go on with your patchwork like a little lady.
Oh, mother, said Maggie in a vehemently cross tone,
I don't want to do my patchwork. What, not your pretty patchwork to make a counterpane for your Aunt Glegg? It's foolish work, said Maggie with a toss of her mane, tearing things to pieces to sew 'em together again. And I don't want to do anything for my Aunt Glegg. I don't like her.
Exit Maggie, dragging her bonnet by the string, while Mr Tulliver laughs audibly.
I wonder at you as you'll laugh at her, Mr Tulliver,
said the mother, with lymphatic fretfulness in her tone.
You encourage her in naughtiness, and her aunts will have it as it's me spoils her.
Mrs Tulliver was what is called a good-tempered person, never cried when she was a baby on any slighter ground than hunger and pins, and from the cradle upwards had been healthy, fair, plump, and dull-witted. In short, the flower of her family for beauty and amiability. But milk and mildness are not the best things for keeping, and when they turn only a little sour, they may disagree with young stomachs seriously. I have often wondered whether those early Madonnas of Raphael, with the blonde faces and somewhat stupid expression, kept their placidity undisturbed when their strong-limbed, strong-willed boys got a little too old to do without clothing. I think they must have been given to feeble remonstrance, getting more and more peevish as it became more and more ineffectual.
Thank you for listening. To continue the book, head to the link in the description below. And click here to subscribe to the Penguin YouTube channel for more audiobook samples and videos with your favourite authors. See you next time.